Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today I will be looking at second order consequences of electric vehicles. Again, if you're not familiar, in second order consequences, it's kind of an exercise where I'm trying to look at when there is a big disruption, when there is something new, what are the consequences of that, and then what are the consequences of the consequences to try and get an overview of how one little change or maybe a big change can have sometimes unintended consequences or unforeseen consequences. So we will look at electric vehicles. I have focused mostly on electric cars because that's where I have the most experience on. But I do mention other vehicles, and some of the things that I mention are applied to other vehicles. So the three main things are that there will be changes in production and changes in the automakers and the energy. There will be environmental impacts to electric vehicles, and there will be everyday use consequences. So let's start from the top with the changes in production. So many automakers have started to transition to electric vehicles, but some of them have been faster than others, although most of them have not been as fast as we would have hoped. And as a result, many of them might not actually survive the transition that we are living through to electric vehicles. So many of them will go bankrupt, or they will merge, or they will get bailed out. On top of that, many of them, or the reason why they might become bankrupt, is because they have a lot of stranded assets for the former cars. The former cars, we call them ICE cars, which stands for internal combustion engine. So they have all the factories specifically to make those cars. They have all the machines, the tools, the cars themselves, the car parts, all of those. At some point, they will not be able to sell them so well. So that will have an impact in the real estate of the factory. Maybe the land might become cheaper. Maybe the factory itself might have to be repurposed for something else when they try to get some of the money back. Maybe cultural events, other factories, housing. Another big change in production for electric vehicles is that there will be a demand for new battery factories. And that, of course, is also impacted by how cheap the land will be. Also, how the repurposing of former factories. This fact that we need the batteries to power the cars. The primary use for the batteries will be cars. Some of the batteries will, of course, be for renewable energy. But there's more vehicles other than cars that are maybe potentially transitioning to electricity. And those are boats, ships, and airplanes. And because they tend to travel longer distances than cars, they will require more energy-dense batteries and more batteries overall. And we don't have the capacity for that yet. So I think that if boats and ships and airplanes will also transition to full 100% electric vehicles, then that transition will be slower than for the cars. I sometimes mention that it's possible that instead they might opt for hydrogen as a fuel because it's more dense, and it could work better for longer distances, but depends also how the battery technology development happens. The changes that might happen also related to automakers is that there might be, for example, a CO2 tax for people that want to use their internal combustion engine car. So this is something that governments would have to enact. They would have to legislate that. And we already see glimpses of this happening in certain, at least European countries. I think in the US, maybe in some places, they are discussing it. But if that actually comes through and it becomes it becomes the norm, so to speak, then these ICE cars, these combustion cars, will become a hobby, and that will make it so that there will be a collector's market regarding them. Also, all of these changes with the automakers and the energy, this will cause a big drop in oil demand. And as I mentioned in the previous second order consequences, the whole fossil fuel industry is also going through a disruption. So in oil specifically, either they will bankrupt, merge, or get bailed out, or they might specialize in plastic applications, which is expected. Here also in the stranded assets, I mentioned, like, even if we transition to all electric cars, what happens to all the other cars that are still around there? Maybe there is something that can be done from them, like maybe we can repurpose it somehow, maybe the cars themselves or the car parts, or maybe the engines or the metal for other industries. So it's not like suddenly we don't use everything from the old cars and we just put them somewhere. I hope that we will use them for something useful. Okay, so that's the changes in production. So far, so straightforward. Some environmental impacts to discuss of electric cars. Immediate one is that there is a lower city air pollution. So that's actually a very positive thing. Lower city noise pollution, that's also a very positive thing. Lower overall greenhouse gas emissions. Again, we're looking at the life cycle assessment of this. We do need some higher mineral or rare earth extractions for batteries. That does have some negative issues. We have the pollution from the extraction, refinement, and transportation. And then, of course, some higher scarcity. Maybe there could be some, especially with the batteries, some competition for the use of resources for other industries like computers and smartphones. But keep in mind that when I mention these negative impacts, conventional fossil fuels have much worse impacts. The problem is that we've already caused many of those impacts, and now to make the transition, we have to make some new impacts. We cannot just flip them over and start fresh. So, yeah, it's a negative impact, but it would be much worse if we didn't do anything, if we just kept driving the normal cars. But going back a bit to these more positive impacts, of course, when you reduce greenhouse gas emissions, long term, that will have a lower cost for society. The noise pollution, the air pollution specifically, will lead to less health effects and a longer life expectancy. And you could see this, depending on your viewpoint, you could see this as a good thing or a bad thing. So a good thing could be that the healthcare system doesn't have so much pressure, which is good, and people live longer. On the other hand, you might have a higher pension system pressure in the future. We don't know how marginal that might be or how effective that might be. Another thing that occurred to me is that if you suddenly don't have the noise from combustion in the cities and cars are just zooming along much more quietly, it is possible there could be slightly more accidents because of that silent driving. And this is coupled with something I will cover soon in the everyday use. But that's something to consider. That could happen. We know electric cars, they have artificial noises added to them to prevent this issue, but those noises sometimes are optional. They can be turned off. So, and even then, the type of noise might not be the same that we are trained to be alert for in crossing a street or something like that. Okay, now for everyday use consequences. So these are things that when you get the car, you kind of feel a bit more closely. So first of all, you have cheaper maintenance costs for the user. And that has an immediate money savings. So you save money, you have more money to spend. But what happens to the repair shops that used to rely on all those parts breaking down, all that complexity? How will they cope with this? Will they go bankrupt? Will they adapt to charge different services? And if they charge different services, what could those be? Maybe some more customization of car parts, but we have specific legislations now to prevent that. So maybe that will change. Or maybe changing the noises the cars make, either to simulate the old combustion noises, or perhaps to add some custom ones, some paint jobs. There's many uncertainties here. We also have that gas stations must transition, and they have already started doing that. So they will have specific charging stations. And because the nature of the charging is that you have to spend maybe 15 minutes or 30 minutes or maybe sometimes an hour, depending on the type of charging, it could be that these gas stations start implementing more services or entertainment, like restaurants or media, like small cinemas. I could see that happening, so that They encourage people to spend time and money with them while they have to wait for their car to charge. We also have an incentive for real estate to start adding charging at home. And that immediately increases the value for housing that has the charging, but also creates the less pressure on the public charging infrastructure and less demand. Here, this might be a bit complex to understand, but I mean that is that right now we are expanding the public charging infrastructure in many countries for electric cars. But and that means that there is a lot of pressure because usually there tends to be more cars than there are public charging stations. So usually you find queues or things like that. So if more people can charge at home, that means there's more available for the public charging infrastructure. On the other hand, if more people charge at home, the people that operate these public charging infrastructures won't get so much money. So that could be a downside to that. As a user driving the car, you experience higher torque. And that is a very exhilarating thing to experience. You can go very fast, very quickly. But it does raise the question, could that lead to higher accidents long term? Because people will abuse that torque to get ahead of someone in the road because, I don't know, they are driving aggressively. And also this will affect the tire wear, which might actually benefit those repair shops that are still around. Lastly, what happens to these outdated batteries once they are no longer unfit for their use in transport? Well, it turns out they are already starting to be used for stationary storage. So even though they may not be good enough to power a car, they still hold enough charge that it's useful to have them in a house or to have them next to the renewable energy that is producing the electricity. So that is a good thing. We don't immediately need to recycle the batteries. Instead, first we will reuse them, and only once they cannot be used for this renewable energy, then they will be recycled. Okay, so now you have hopefully a bigger idea of all the possibilities of what can happen when we switch to electric vehicles. You have your user experience, which will change. You have the environmental impacts, which maybe you only see more long term. Maybe more immediately, you will see this economic impact with the current automakers and the transport industry that will completely change the offerings that they have, and how they might not even exist at all in some years. So hopefully you now understand a bit more of what the electric vehicles will bring. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.